So we're also interested in early literacy environments, and particularly in shared book reading in the home. So we're interested in this because we know from a lot of years of research that parents play an important role in shaping children's emergent literacy through activities like shared book reading. Shared book reading can foster early literacy acquisition, print awareness, phonological awareness, story comprehension, and is a predictor for future success in school. Now, I always want to kind of pause on this and say that this doesn't mean that, shared book reading is a necessary thing for children to experience to acquire literacy, right there. It is a relatively new thing, actually, historically, for parents to read with their children at home. It isn't something that has been, going on for centuries. So clearly, it's not necessary for language acquisition, right, which we know children can also do, and even for literacy. But part of what happens is, because a lot of parents do this, right, and because a lot of children come to school already with this exposure, which does help them learn, it starts to become something that we, kind of expect children to already have exposure to and to know. And so it's also important for us to make immigrant families aware of this, right, and for them to have opportunities to expose their child to shared book reading, to prepare them for school. So what do we know about reading practices in Latina families? Well, there's been, some research on this, and most of it compares the practices of Latina families to non-Latina white families. And so that research suggests that Latina families have fewer books at home, read less often to their children, experience some barriers to reading, and use fewer interactive reading strategies. So, of course, this is all in comparison to non-Latina white families, and it's, a lot of this can kind of have the feel of what we call research that is sort of comes a little bit from a deficit perspective, right? That is sort of comparing to a different to a standard of a monolingual, English-speaking, white middle-class family without really understanding the specific context of Latina families. So we wanted to kind of take a step back from this and really try to understand the context of shared book reading in Latina families and the heterogeneity that exists within Latina families themselves. Okay, so study one is trying to understand Latina parents' beliefs and practices related to shared reading with young children. And what we did is we started out with this model that has been proposed about how parental literacy and socioeconomic status influence parents' reading beliefs, and that influences their home reading practices. So this is, a model that has existed for a long time and was kind of developed and sort of based on, monolingual white families. And what we started to do is to think, well, some aspects of this model seem like they might apply also in Latina families, but what are some unique elements that might be relevant in Latina families that are not part of this model? So we are kind of trying to think about this model, but adding a few different things. So one is, when we think about parent literacy, well, bilingual families have different levels of literacy potentially in each of their languages, right? And we thought it was important to look at parents' literacy in both English and in Spanish, especially in the context of the US, where most of the books available, right, and the kind of reading and early literacy resources are in English. So we're looking at parents' literacy in both English and in Spanish. We're also looking at parental education. And then in addition to parents' beliefs about reading with children, we also wanted to know their beliefs about bilingualism, okay? And how all of this together relates to their home reading practices. What I'm gonna show you is baseline data from a larger study of a pediatric-based early literacy program. All of the parents were recruited in a pediatric clinic. They all identified as Hispanic or Latino, and they completed a survey and an interview in a language of their choice, either in English or in Spanish. So we ended up with 106 parents who identified, again, as Hispanic or Latino. All of their children, the child was between 1 and 3 years old, and 90% of the parents were moms, and then 10% were dads. Now, you can see that we had a pretty even distribution of maternal education, about a third having high school or less, a third some college, and about a third a college degree or higher. You can also see that there is a pretty, kind of wide distribution in terms of the language that they prefer to use with their child. So some prefer to use all or mostly English, some prefer to use both English and Spanish, and then some prefer to use almost all Spanish. And then finally, when we looked at their literacy, we saw kind of high and low levels of literacy for both English and Spanish, patterning differently. So 42% of the sample self-reported high levels of literacy in both English and Spanish. 43% reported high literacy in English but low literacy in Spanish. 11% reported high literacy in Spanish but low in English, and only 5% reported low literacy in both English and in Spanish. So already I think we're getting some additional information here than if we had only collected their information about literacy in Spanish, which would have given us an incomplete picture. Here's some of the questions that we asked. So we asked about their beliefs about bilingualism, and here are some example questions. I'll tell you a little bit more about this when I present the result. The questions about parent reading beliefs were taken from that previous model and study that I showed you. So it asked questions like, for example, asking parents how much they agree or disagree with statements like this. So reading helps children be better talkers and better listeners. My child is too young to learn about reading. I don't read to my child because we have nothing to read. I enjoy reading with my child. And schools are responsible for teaching children, not parents. Those are a sample of the kinds of statements that parents rate. And then finally, to get at their home reading practices, we used an instrument that's called the STIMQ, the read section of the STIMQ, that asks about the number of books at home. We also asked the number of books they had in Spanish, how much parents share books with their child, the types of books that they have at home, and then the kinds of interactions they do when they're reading, okay? And this is done as an interview for the parent in either English and or Spanish, whatever they felt more comfortable in. Okay, so here are the results. So first of all, in terms of parent reading beliefs, you can see that most parents had very positive beliefs about reading with young children. So the maximum, the scale is 5, and the average was 4.4, so they're scoring pretty high in terms of their beliefs about reading. When we asked, reading helps children be better talkers and better listeners, 100% of parents agreed, so a lot of agreement on that. And when we said things like, my child is too young to learn about reading, 94% disagreed with that, so clearly, they had beliefs about reading that reading was important. And one thing that's interesting is that this is quite a bit higher than previous studies with Latina families have found, and that might be that our sample is not representative and is kind of more interested in shared reading than others, but it could also be that there has been a change over time, because the last time there was a study of this was like 10 years ago, and there's a lot more information now in the media and in public, health campaigns about the importance of reading with young kids. So this might also be a reflection of that. When we asked about beliefs about bilingualism, we ended up categorizing the responses into 3 buckets about this, right? Because they're not all the same. So one set of items clustered together as reflecting parents' beliefs in the importance of Spanish in particular. So for example, these were parents who agreed with statements like children should learn to speak Spanish to retain their culture, having a strong foundation in Spanish will help children learn English, being bilingual is not only a direct benefit for children but for the family as well, etc. So this is reflecting the importance of Spanish. On the other end over here, there were some items that reflected parents' beliefs about the advantages of English, or about kind of being bilingual but more from an English perspective. So it's important for children to learn English because that's the language they need to succeed in this country, or knowing English facilitates talking to people in the community. And then there were 2 items that really kind of reflect parents that had concerns about bilingualism. So they might feel very positively, right, about the importance of Spanish and the importance of English, but they still had some concerns. So these were parents who would agree with statements like hearing to languages can be confusing and difficult for children, and learning to languages can cause language or speech delays. There was a lot of agreement about the idea that being bilingual has clear advantages in children's lives. I'm only showing you one item of that, but there was a lot of agreement on all of the items here, kind of on this end of the scale. There was also a fair amount of agreement, although a little bit less for this, about the importance of Spanish, right? And so there was sort of a little bit more variability in how strongly parents felt about that. And then, interestingly, there was also variability in these last two items about concerns about bilingualism. Most parents disagreed, right, strongly disagreed with the idea that learning two languages can cause language or speech delays, which, by the way, is a myth, is a misconception, is not true. I should have said that at first, that these two are kind of myths or misconceptions. Most parents disagreed, but on the item about hearing two languages can be confusing and difficult, there was a spread in terms of how much parents agreed with that statement. On showing you how these are related, so finally, in terms of home reading practices, we saw a kind of a nice sort of normal distribution on this, with most parents kind of being on the middle of the scale. But interestingly, 100% of parents had said that they started to read with their child. Remember, children are between 1 and 3 years old, so they're starting, to read with their child when they're young. And then there was a range in terms of the number of books they have at home, their reading frequency, and a lot of them reported doing interactive reading strategies, but there was kind of a range in here. Here's how it all kind of fits together. Hopefully I can walk you through this. So the first thing is we replicated, some of the relationships that had been found in other samples. Not too surprising that maternal education was related to parents' reading beliefs and to their home reading practices in the sample. And parent literacy in English was also related to their reading beliefs and to their home reading practices. Interestingly, parent literacy in Spanish was not related to parent reading beliefs or to home reading practices. And I'll say a little bit more because there's a twist in this, but there was no direct relationship between parent literacy in Spanish and either reading beliefs or reading practices, which was surprising to us, certainly to me. Parent literacy in Spanish was related to their beliefs about the importance of Spanish, so parents who were more Spanish dominant sort of had stronger feelings about the importance of their child learning Spanish. Parent literacy in English was negatively related to their concerns about bilingualism. So parents who had higher literacy in English expressed less concern about bilingualism potentially being confusing, and that was also their concerns about bilingualism were negatively related to their home reading practices. So parents who had higher concerns about bilingualism did less of the reading practices. Okay, now here's where it gets a little maybe more interesting, maybe more confusing. So there were some moderating relationships here. The relationship between parental reading beliefs and home reading practices, which have been found before, was moderated by maternal education. And so what we found here is that mothers with lower levels of education, a high school degree or less, in their case, reading beliefs were not associated with their home reading practices. And what we interpret this to be, and let me just say, and we found a similar thing for mothers who had low literacy levels in English as well, where their reading beliefs were not related to their home reading practices. So here's kind of how we interpret that, which is that for moms that have low literacy levels in English and had lower levels of education, believing in the importance of reading wasn't enough to engage in a lot of reading activities at home, right? There were other barriers to reading that didn't have to do with how much they believed in the importance of reading or, wanting to read, but probably likely to their language barriers, to their literacy barriers that got in the way of reading with their child in the way that they believed was important, right? So it kind of suggests that just providing information and kind of knowledge about the importance of reading isn't enough to increase reading practices in a lot of these cases, especially for moms with low literacy in English. And we saw a similar thing in the relationship between concerns about bilingualism and home reading practices, in that concerns about bilingualism were negatively related to home reading practices, especially for parents who read in Spanish, right? So if you are a parent who feels more comfortable reading in Spanish to your child, but you also have concerns about bilingualism, you're less likely to engage in reading with your child, right? Because you're probably thinking, well, is this actually beneficial, or is this confusing if I'm reading in Spanish, right? If you have some of those beliefs. So in this case, it does seem like providing information about misconceptions about bilingualism could be supportive in enabling parents to read with their child in Spanish in their home language, if that's how they feel more comfortable. Okay, so I know that was a lot of different relationships, but just to kind of wrap that up. So I think one of the important things is just that there's a lot of variation in reading practices in Latina families. They're associated with maternal education and literacy in English, with beliefs about reading with children, and with their beliefs about bilingualism. And I think this idea that is important, that links between beliefs and practices exist, but not for all families, right? Or it's not the only thing, of course, right? Sort of increasing knowledge, like the campaigns and sort of public messages that we see about importance of reading can be important, but it's not enough for a lot of parents to know that reading is important to actually be able to read with their child. And so it's important to consider factors outside of this that may negatively impact the ability of particularly Spanish-speaking parents to engage in early literacy activities with their children. The thing that we didn't do in that study is that we didn't ask about their books and their literacy activities across each of their two languages separately. So we asked about reading overall. So we then said, okay, well, we want to develop a questionnaire that actually asks about literacy activities and about reading in Spanish and in English separately. So I'm not going to show you this in detail because it's based off of the other study, and so you already have a lot of the background, but just imagine that we're asking similar questions, but this time we're asking about the number of books they have at home in English and in Spanish, about how important they believe it is to read in English and in Spanish. What ended up being most interesting in the study is we asked about how parents feel, what they do and how they feel when they read in each of the two languages, okay? So when you read to your child in English or in Spanish, how happy do you feel? How difficult does it feel? So in this study, we had 125 parents. Ages in the children was a little broader, from 1 to 6. Again, we had a range of maternal education levels and of parental language use. Parents had more books in English than in Spanish for their kids, not too surprising because they're much more widely available. 57% of families said it was difficult to find books in Spanish, while very few said it was difficult to find books in English. But the other thing that was really interesting is that we asked about the different types of books that they have, and even though they have more books overall in English and Spanish, one of the things that was really interesting is that they have a variety of different types of books that they read in English and in Spanish and in both languages. So even if they have sort of more books in English than in Spanish, children do seem to be getting a variety of different types of stories and books across both of their languages, which is something that was interesting for us to see. How many books they had in English and Spanish was not too surprisingly related to both maternal education and to the parents' kind of dominant language, so I won't spend too much on this. But the one thing that I do think is interesting and worth highlighting is that we asked parents about their preferred language for speaking with their child and then what language they read with their child in. And what we found is that overall, parents who prefer to speak in English read more in English, and parents who prefer to speak to their child in Spanish read more in Spanish than the other parents. But parents who prefer to speak in Spanish to their child still read more in English than they do in Spanish. So there is a discrepancy, right, in the language that parents prefer to use probably for themselves, the language that they're more proficient in, the language that they prefer to talk to their child in, and the language that they read in. And so this is one of the things that probably makes such a big difference for parents that are, Spanish speaking, that are dominant Spanish speakers, which is that they, for a couple of probably different reasons, don't have as many options to read with their child in their language of preference, right? And that might be partly because of the books that are available, as we saw in the previous slide. And we don't know this for sure, but partly because a lot of the messages that parents get about reading with their children is that it's to prepare your child for school, which if you are in a country where your kids are going to go to school in English, then a lot of the message seems to be that the important thing is to read in English. And so you might have a lot of parents kind of making an effort to read in English, even when that's not their preferred language, and that's likely to impact the interaction. The last thing is that we did this analysis of parents' positive feelings, negative feelings, and instructive behaviors in each language. And what we found is that parents report that when their preferred language is Spanish, they have more positive feelings about reading with their child when they read in Spanish than when they read in English. And they also have more negative feelings about reading when they read in the language that is not their preferred language. So it really does seem that being able to read in their preferred language is something that would increase positive feelings about reading and decrease some of their negative feelings about reading, but parents don't always feel like they have the option to do that. The last thing is the same thing for instructive behaviors, where they do more interactive behaviors when they're reading in their preferred language. We then said, okay, let's actually see and observe parents and see what they do when they read with their kids. And so here we wondered, how do Latino parents actually use both of their languages when sharing books with their preschool children? And does this differ depending on whether they're reading a book that's only in English, or in this case, a bilingual book that's in English and Spanish? So we haven't compared English to Spanish books, but we wanted to be able to compare a context that is English only to one where parents had the option, right? Because it's a bilingual book in Spanish and English. Okay, so we did the study during the pandemic, so we looked at shared book reading over Zoom. You can see the cute pictures of parents and kids reading at home. So we mailed parents 2 books to the home. One was a monolingual book, one was a bilingual book, and we observed them. This was a small study of 24 parents, all Hispanic or Latino, and the kids were between 3 and 5 years of age. And again, you can see the distribution of maternal education and language. We see, again, this same thing that I mentioned in the study before, where even when parents prefer to use Spanish with their child, they were reporting that they read more in English, but we wanted to see what actually happened when we observed them. Okay, so here are the books that we selected. So we selected 2 books that were commercially available in both monolingual and bilingual formats. And were appropriate for 3 to 5-year-olds. They were story books, not concept books. And we specifically picked, in this case, books where the themes and the characters were not specifically about Latino culture, because we wanted to do another study comparing for that. And they're roughly matched for text. So some parents got that kind of order. So, my friends was the bilingual version, and How Do I Love You was the English version, so that they wouldn't get bored, right, reading the same book in both formats. And then other parents got the other order, and we counterbalanced also whether they did the bilingual or the monolingual book first or second. So now you get to see a cute little video.
This is a nice color. What color is this? Yay. Yeah. My friend. Hey, what is she doing here?
I was looking for an.
Yeah, I think she's looking for an cat. All right, we said, I learned to walk my friend, the cat. Hey.
Hey.
Do you know a cat? ¿Cómo se llama el gato de la esquina? De la tiendita de la esquina. What's the cat's name? You remember? Sugar. So you know a cat.
So that was them reading, one of the books, and you can see them kind of talking about it. If you speak Spanish, you could catch the mom switching to Spanish and asking some questions. So what we did is we transcribed all the interactions, but we were focusing in this analysis only on what we call parents' extra-textual talk. So we weren't focused on the reading from the book, but what they, all that extra talk that they were doing about the story. And we also excluded unrelated talk, like when the child runs away and the parent is trying to get them to sit back down, which always happens. Okay, so then we annotated the utterances that were only in English, only in Spanish, or mixed. We also tagged the individual words that were switched. And then we did an analysis on CISLL, which is software where we looked at the number of word tokens, meaning just total different words, and then the number of word types, so meaning different words that they used in English and Spanish, the number of utterances that had code switches, and then we calculated the proportion of Spanish tokens and the proportion of Spanish types, because we were specifically interested in whether they used more Spanish in this context, so we kind of focused on the Spanish. So we had a number of different potential hypotheses for this. So one was that we thought the bilingual book would kind of license parents to use more Spanish and more code switching, right? That they would see the Spanish in the book and that kind of means Spanish is accepted, I can do this, right? I can use Spanish, I can do code switching, and that they would use more Spanish overall. That was one. The second is that the bilingual book would provide more specific Spanish models. So, because they would have more different words in Spanish, the parents would use more different words in Spanish in their extra textual talk, kind of borrowing from the book, right? So it gives you these ideas about things to talk about in Spanish. But we did have a potential counter hypothesis, which is we thought, well, maybe parents will actually use more Spanish in the English-only book because they're kind of compensating for the fact that the book is only in English, and they'll want to speak in Spanish to kind of infuse more Spanish in the interaction. So those are sort of our competing hypotheses. Let me just tell you what they did with just the reading, because I was a little bit curious what would happen here too. So, of course, in the English book, they only read in English. But in the bilingual book, almost all of the parents read the English and the Spanish text on each page just as they went. So I wasn't sure, I thought maybe some parents will read the whole story in Spanish and then we'll read the whole story in English. Nobody did that. Everybody just read both languages on each page as they were presented. What happened with the extra textual talk? Overall, parents did use a higher proportion of Spanish word tokens in the bilingual book than in the English-only book. In their extra textual talk, we saw the same thing for word types. And you might be wondering, I don't have these plotted here, but because this is a proportion, it could have been that Spanish went up, or it could have been that English went down. Spanish went up. So there was no change in the number of word tokens or types in English, but there was an increase in the number of word tokens in Spanish and the number of word types in Spanish in the bilingual book. So they were essentially using more extra textual talk, but only by increasing Spanish. And there were no differences in their code switches, surprisingly. It was sort of trending in that direction, but not statistically significant. The last thing that we looked at, we didn't really design the study to look at this, so take it with a grain of salt because it's a small sample. But we thought that this might differ depending on the parent's own proficiency in Spanish or in English, right? But what we found that's a little surprising is that there was no interaction between Spanish proficiency and the extent to which parents used more Spanish in the bilingual book. So overall, they used more Spanish overall in both books if they were more proficient in Spanish than if they were less proficient in Spanish. But there was no interaction. So what you can see here, each of this is one individual family and how much more Spanish they used in the bilingual book, which is in red, and in the monolingual book, which is in blue. And you can see that in almost every case, they are using more Spanish in the bilingual than in the monolingual book, regardless of their Spanish proficiency. So it seemed to work for all the parents in similar ways, although, not every parent did it to the same extent, but there wasn't an interaction here. Overall, caregivers use more Spanish words in total and more different Spanish words when sharing the bilingual than the monolingual book, and this did not come at the expense of using English, just using more Spanish. They didn't seem to use more code switch utterances. We might need additional study on that because our sample was small. And we didn't see that this differed as a function of caregivers' language proficiency. So we conclude that books with text in Spanish and English can support Latina caregivers' use of Spanish in extra-textual talk relative to books with only English text. These two books that we picked, right, were sort of two books that are bilingual or sort of half Spanish. But of course, books are more than just about the language itself. There's the themes in the books, there's the characters. We selected these in particular as books that were not, in any particular way kind of representing Hispanic or Latino culture, but we were curious about what is the representation of, Hispanic characters and stories in the books that are available for children that are books in Spanish or Spanish-English bilingual. And so with the student and this other colleague, we did an analysis of 200 picture books from libraries, all picture books in Spanish or Spanish-English bilinguals. And I'll just tell you very quickly what we found, which is that most of these books are written by non-Hispanic authors, published in the US, and translated from English to Spanish, rather than being originally Spanish-written picture books and texts. Of the ones that are dual language books, 93% of them are translational books, and most of them, the English text is presented in a more prominent and salient position than the Spanish text. So it's this funny thing where even when we're focusing on Spanish language children's books, Spanish kind of has a subservient role to English in the text, both by being translated from English rather than originally written in Spanish, and by being kind of in a less prominent position in the book itself, which we had kind of noticed from our interactions. So on the one hand, we are seeing that bilingual books boost parents' Spanish language use. On the other hand, it seems like we can still do a lot more to make those books where Spanish is kind of has the more prominent role in those books, and where the books are probably written and kind of created by Hispanic and Latino authors, and are representative of families' experiences. Takeaway points from the whole presentation. So I know I talked about lots of little different things, and hopefully there's some takeaways from each of the studies. But overall, I want to leave you with the message that Latina immigrant children experience unique interactional contexts that shape their opportunities to learn language, to develop literacy, and to become multilingual. All things which I would strongly say are their right? That it is a right that children should have to be able to have this. These contexts are shaped by broader social forces, not only by what parents do or what parents believe, but really broader social forces, including patterns of residential segregation, access to books and learning materials, and the educational opportunities available not just to children, but to parents themselves. And so to support bilingual children's learning and development, it's important that we consider the heterogeneity that exists in bilingual children's experiences and these broader contexts that shape the interactions. And thank you to all of you and to my lab and team and everyone who has been involved in this work. Thank you.